So now we're moving into an ethical theory that sort of doesn't fit with the other theories that we're looking at. And you're going to really notice this when we cover the sequel to this lesson. Moral sentimentalism, it just really renders moral judgments to be something unlike the logic of all the other ethical theories we've been looking at. So let's just begin here with a simple definition. Moral sentimentalism is the view that emotions and desires, as opposed to reason, play a leading role in the anatomy of morality. So as you will learn in the lessons on Immanuel Kant, some people, like Kant, think that moral judgments are driven by reason. But the sentimentalists think that's entirely wrong. Really, emotion is pervasive. Everywhere you look in a moral judgment, in any kind of moral preference, you find emotion. So the two people we'll be covering for today are Hume and Smith, David Hume and Adam Smith, two best friends, I might add. And, they were around in the 1700s. And as such, some of the people that they argued against we're not really covering in this course. For example, it was Hume that kind of began to publish before Adam Smith. He was, of course, 12 years the elder, so that made sense. And Hume argued against essentially many widely held views during his time. And we're not covering most of them. I mean, we're only covering one. So Hume did go against everyone, and in a course on David Hume, you might actually look at all those arguments. I'm only going to cover an argument that might get lobbed against something like ethical egoism. Now, he didn't call it ethical egoism, and certainly we're not really covering it the way that ethical egoism was construed at the time. But this argument does work for the version of ethical egoism that we're covering. So might as well take a look at it because it just kind of shows you the style that David Hume brings to his argumentation. It really can be called, a style when it comes to Hume, almost pithy and direct and to the point, and it seems obvious once you've said it. So here it is. If moral judgments were really rooted in self-interest, then we would only make moral judgments about things that affect our self-interest. That makes sense. But we make moral judgments about things that happened in different times and places. In other words, things that have no effect on us. Therefore, our moral judgments are not rooted in self-interest. I mean, once you lay it out like that and you realize, actually, I do reliably make moral judgments about things that have nothing to do with me, and it becomes so obvious that there's something severely lacking about ethical egoism. Sure, sometimes we make arguments, moral judgments based off self-interest, but not always. And this is something that Hume and Smith repeatedly say. Other theories have something right about them, but they're all partially correct. Or, well, maybe I shouldn't say they're all partially correct, but they are incomplete, at best. There is something deeper that no one had really mentioned yet. So Hume's own view is half of what we're covering, so let's get into that. So everything we've covered so far is his negative views, right? He was attacking other people. We only covered one attack, but still. But Hume's positive account, it's something like this. Moral approval is caused, if not constituted by, pleasure of a certain kind, of a special kind. So moral approval, moral preferences are either caused by or are identical with, or almost identical with, certain kind of feeling. To have the sense of virtue is nothing but to feel a satisfaction of particular kind from the contemplation of a character. Maybe you've heard that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, Hume is going a little further. He's saying literally moral rightness, moral goodness is also in the eye of the beholder. It's something that you feel when for example, you feel virtue when you see a virtuous person. Now, you think the virtue is in the person, but no, it's in you. It's in you perceiving some action that you approve of. And so Hume is taking all the moral properties that we've been talking about so far, And he's basically putting them in your head. That's where they really come from. They're not in the people you are looking at. If you see someone performing something that you would consider morally wrong, it makes no sense to look for the moral wrongness in the action. You have to look within you, right? It's in the mind of the beholder. So both Hume and his friend Smith discussed the notion of sympathy, a concept that lines up more so with our modern term empathy, although Rasmussen argues that this is more so true of Smith than of Hume. So how does this whole mechanism happen? How do we feel, or how do we intuit? Now, intuit's probably not the right word, but how do we construct this feeling of moral rightness when we see an action that we approve of? Well, they called it sympathy. What they really meant by it, well, no, they really meant sympathy by it, but today we use the word empathy to mean what they meant. So it lines up with empathy, although I'll keep saying sympathy throughout. But just know that whenever I say sympathy, I really mean empathy. And so it's kind of difficult to distinguish Hume and Smith certain times. And this is one of those cases where really Smith is the one that more so uses the word like as to mean empathy. At least that's what Rasmussen argues. But really, it's almost like we look at Hume through the lens of Smith nowadays. So whatever. Okay, so let's look at these views. And earlier in this lesson, I mentioned that there are some disagreements between Hume and Smith. And so now we begin to move towards the views of Smith, which at least this instructor thinks are stronger. And I'll make the case for that. And there are 4 points where Smith disagrees with Hume, although they agree. What they agree on overlap is a great overlap, right? But on those little tiny things they disagree on, I feel like those are instructive. So we're going to look at those right now so you can see that Smith's view is probably a little bit stronger than Hume's. So, for Hume, sympathy is more mechanical and passive. When we see, say, joy in another person, if we have this fellow feeling of sympathy with this person, then we feel a similar joy, perhaps simply adjusted to a more moderate degree. So when I see this woman, she's smiling, she looks happy. That's nice. It makes me feel pretty good too, right? Not as good as her, maybe, but an overall kind of pleasant sensation goes over me. Thus, it is almost like a contagion for Hume. So, call this the contagion view of sympathy, right? So you just see it, and it's kind of a mechanical response. You see it, and instinctually you respond with this fellow feeling. But Smith, on the other hand, makes the case that sympathy doesn't arise merely from witnessing some person's emotional event. There is also a need for understanding the social context that person is going through. You need to know more than just what they look like, right? To really feel what they're feeling, you need to understand the social order that they're a part of. Only when we understand the context can we truly put ourselves in the place of the other and feel what they feel. For Smith, then, sympathy is an imaginative projection of ourselves into the situation of another person. Call it the projection view of sympathy. So if you were to look at this woman here and think to yourself that you know what she's feeling, well, wouldn't you like to know the context, really? I mean, you can't really tell. That could be just contemplation. That could be tiredness. You're not really sure. Maybe it's sadness, right? So you need a bit of the social order, and only then can you truly project yourself into the situation and truly feel what they are feeling. So Smith hashes out the benefits of his account of sympathy over Hume's in the very first chapter of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Goes to show you that the Theory of Moral Sentiments, really that's Smith's book, by the way, he really thought his main interlocutor, the person he was really arguing with, was his own buddy Hume. Apparently that's who he thought most highly of. So that's who he really kind of endeavored to show in his book, kind of juxtapose his position from Hume. For example, we sometimes cringe over the actions of others, isn't that the truth? Even though they are blissfully unaware of their faux pas. So maybe you've seen someone do something they really shouldn't have done, but they don't even know. They're not even aware of it. And you're thinking to yourself, "Oh man, I want to just get in a hole in the ground and not be conscious of this anymore." So, of course, in that case, contagion doesn't really make sense. Who are you catching it from, right? The person doesn't even feel it. We also feel pity for the dead. So here is how you summarize all that. In neither of these cases is the person we are sympathizing with actually feeling what we're feeling. The first is unaware, and the second feels nothing because they're dead. So make sure that makes sense to you. Here's the point. A contagion account cannot explain why we feel what we do. We can't catch their feelings since they're not feeling them. If you feel embarrassed for someone, but they don't even feel embarrassed for themselves, you can't catch it. They don't have it, right? So that's one way. Same thing with a dead person. They don't feel anything. They're dead. So if you feel bad for them, again, you're not catching it from them. You're projecting yourself into their position. But a projection account deals with these problems easily. We project ourselves into their situation and feel what they should have or would have felt if say, they were alive. Okay, here is a second way that Smith disagrees with Hume and kind of just expands on Hume's views. I mean, a lot of what Smith does is expanding on Hume. Minor corrections and more so an expansion. Agreeing with Hume, Smith says it's obvious that utility pleases. For example, a well-made house. Things that serve their function well are pleasing. That's obvious. Hume talks about this at great length in his second inquiry, as well as a treatise. And so that's clearly something they agree on. But Smith adds the following point. We sometimes confuse the ends and the means. In other words, perceived utility might drive us towards some objects or behaviors, but it's only perceived utility. It's not real utility. So here's where it counts. But we are prone to err on whether perceived utility leads to actual utility. And so it appears that Smith is referring to something like effective forecasting errors. So Smith's point here in a nutshell, in a unforgivably small nutshell, is basically that just because it looks like it'll make you happy doesn't mean that it will actually make you happy. And we make these errors pretty regularly. So he's pointing out that we have to be aware of this. This is something that our cognition appears to, kind of fall prey to pretty regularly. So this is very wild and brings us to our sidebar, because Smith is, I don't want to say, I'll say it, shockingly ahead of his time. So here is a very modern book. In his best-selling Stumbling on Happiness, Daniel Gilbert reviews the literature in social psychology that shows that we reliably make effective forecasting errors, i.e. incorrect predictions about how we will feel in the future. I do recommend this book, by the way. It's in the very least humorous, because we do make a ton of mistakes when we try to predict what will make us happy. So it's very surprising that now we have all the social psychology to show that Smith was right. But Smith was onto something, 200 plus years ago. So very interesting little kind of sidebar there. But Smith is not only known for that. Miller and Page, who are experts in the field of complexity science, recognize the work of Adam Smith as early studies into complex adaptive systems, and note that his Wealth of Nations is the earliest document of complexity science. This is a huge deal. It is tough to understand complex systems. That's why agent-based modeling is a thing, and I'll throw in a link at the end of this lesson so you can see what agent-based modeling is. But it looks like Smith was onto this, and he was already trying to think about these kind of things without the help of computers, which is really the only way to understand complex adaptive systems. So again, terribly ahead of his time, and we're not done yet. Smith, at least according to Richard Thaler in his little history of behavioral economics, argues that Smith's work is proto-behavioral economics. I don't know if I butchered that sentence or not, but essentially Smith was already doing, even though he's doing, classical economics too, it appears that he's already mixing psychology and economics. So that's today is called behavioral economics. So what Thaler says is he was already kind of doing that. You can call it a proto-behavioral economics. Again, terribly, terribly ahead of his time, shockingly ahead of his time. Of course, not to be outdone, his BFF, David Hume, also basically wrote the founding documents for his own science. In his chapter of the Oxford Handbook of Hume, Jesse Prinz lays out how Hume's work, in particular his treatise, lays the groundwork for the field of cognitive science. And if you know a little bit about cognitive science, you know that when you read Hume, you kind of pick up on all these little things that he was saying that were already foretelling the field of cognitive science. In any case, okay, let's go back here. Let's look at another thing that Smith and Hume disagree on, and where Smith appears to be more Humean than Hume. So, Smith also diverges from Hume on the origins of justice. Both agree that justice is essential for the functioning of society. Indeed, justice is the most essential virtue. That makes sense. If no one respects the law, then things do fall apart. So with this, they agree on this. They agree with Hobbes. But whereas Hume believes that the origins of justice come from the recognition that it is essential to avoiding societal collapse, Smith believes it is much less abstract and much more personal. So in other words, Hume thinks that justice comes from us reflecting on, we really need justice, otherwise everything would fall apart. But Smith says, it can't really be that. And he'll make his case in a second. For Smith, it is resentment against those that harm innocence that leads us to approve of justice and disapprove of unjust actions. Very human argument, you'll see, but take a look here at the victims from the 7/7 bombings. It's tough to even look at, and it's this kind of thing that makes you hate terrorism. Just looking at these people makes you hate terrorism, hate terrorists. And it's this that makes you say, no, we need justice. We need people to follow the rules. We can't have this. And so Smith notes that all or almost all people know the feeling of resentment, like the resentment you feel towards terrorists. But very few people reflect on the nature and necessity of justice. When was the last time you really thought about justice? And why does it originate? Is that really something that crossed your mind recently? Thus, it is much more probable, argues Smith, that justice is considered a virtue for the former reason than the latter, an argument that appears to be more Humean than Hume's. In other words, you felt resentment for people that do bad things. But it's a lot less clear that you've been thinking about justice as an abstract principle, right? Or the nature of justice. So what's more likely? How did you really come to agree that justice is important? It's probably from the resentment, something we all feel, and not philosophical reflections on the nature of justice or on the necessity of justice. So that is, both Smith and Hume are known for their emphasizing the role of the passions, emotions, right? And downplaying the role of reason. This is why they were both kind of considered, well, at least certainly Hume was considered a heretic. It was in the middle of the Enlightenment. And they're saying, you shouldn't think reason does all of that. So they were anachronistic in a way, out of place in time. And so it is fascinating that Hume kind of began this train of thought, although Smith, sometimes when Hume was not so careful, Smith would come in and kind of rescue his friend and make some minor corrections to the overall view. So very interesting argument here from Smith on the nature of justice. Okay, last one. Last disagreement with his friend. Lastly, Smith, unlike his friend, stresses that religion is motivated by some of the best impulses in humankind, the love of virtue, and it provides some important benefits, such as comfort at the time of death. So Hume is pretty reliably a critic of religion. Very rarely did he say something positive about religion. That's why he is known as the great infidel. But Smith says, no, it looks like there are some benefits to religion, and it's not just cynicism. It's not just doing good things to get into heaven. Some people do love virtue, and it shows, at least partially, in their actions. Most importantly, Smith argues that religion underwrites or buttresses morality. Morality doesn't come from religion, but religious belief does motivate good behavior. So clearly arguing here against divine command theorists. Both Smith and Hume really argued against them. But Smith adds something here, something that we learned from the lesson Eyes in the Sky. It looks like if you get primed for religious ideas, if you are thinking about your religion, you do behave better. And Smith stresses this too. Religious belief, probably all false. As we know from his essay that didn't get published until he died, he probably was maybe an atheist is too strong of a word, but maybe a deist is a fitting label. He certainly believed that God wasn't involved in your life. He doesn't answer prayers, right? So it's definitely not an all-loving God. So Smith probably would have thought that God doesn't care if you're good or bad, but the belief in God probably does make you behave more good than bad. Interesting ideas here. And the point of all this, it's a very interesting, very deflationary account of morality. We're going to look at views that focus on reason, right? Kantianism and utilitarianism. They're all about, for example, utilitarianism is about calculating what's really the best action. And Hume and Smith are saying, if you're looking for the origins of morality in reason or in culture or in self-interest, which they called self-love, or in religion, well, reason does play a role. Culture does play a role. Religion does play a role. But that's not the root. It all ultimately comes from feelings. Emotion is pervasive in moral judgments, and any theory that doesn't recognize this, Hume and Smith say, is incomplete.